Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening for the webinar that will commemorate 10 years of Pope Francis' groundbreaking encyclical on care of our common home, known as Laudato Si. The webinar is being jointly hosted by the Social Apostolate Desk of Southern Africa Province of the Jesuits and the Jesuit Institute in South Africa. I am Clemens Mtumtema, a Jesuit priest, director of Severa House Social Justice Center and Development in Shawasha, just outside Harare in Zimbabwe. I'm also the provincial delegate for social apostolate activities of the Jesuits in Southern Africa. Our speaker tonight is Peter Knox, Dr. Peter Knox, my former lecturer. We used to call him PK. He's a Jesuit priest and works as a theologian at Jesuit Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa. Peter has been involved in issues to do with environment even before Pope Francis published Laudato Si in 2015. He has taught theology in Pretoria, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Manila. He has a PhD as a doctorate in systematic theology from St. Paul University in Ottawa in Canada. So this evening will go as follows. After this introduction, Father Peter will talk for about 40 minutes, exactly 40 minutes. Then we have 15 minutes for questions and more general discussions. And we'll end promptly at 8 p.m. So in order for question and answer session to be useful as possible, please try to type your questions in the comment box so that we can be ready for the time to answer your questions. I'm advising you to mute all your microphones until it is time for general discussions. And when you're invited to also engage in the talk. So the meeting will be recorded, and in a couple of days, it will be available on our YouTube channel of Jesuit Institute in South Africa. Thank you very much. Peter, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Let me just start my screen share so that we can actually see what I'm talking about. I find it always helps to have some notes when people are following. So it's a pleasure to have you all this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me show you what we're planning to talk about this evening. So here's our brief agenda. We've done the welcome, or Father Clemens has given us the welcome. Then we're going to talk about, for a few minutes, what is an encyclical. Many of us talk about encyclical all the time, but some of us don't really know what we mean by that term. And then why does Laudato Si stand out among all the encyclicals that we've come across? I'll do a very brief summary of the contents of Laudato Si, the encyclical on care for our common home by Pope Francis. Some takeaways, that is just some sound bites. By giving us some sound bites, I don't want to reduce the importance of everything that's said there, but I think it's important for us to just have a few words that we can take away and say, this is what Pope Francis is talking about in Laudato Si. Every year the Church celebrates Laudato Si week. We're beginning also, it seems that we're going to begin to share a common week with other Christians around the world in different denominations called the Laudato Si month, or Care of Creation, a month. But we'll talk about that when we talk about celebrations. I want to have a look at what has changed since 2015. If nothing's changed, then we have to ask ourselves, what is there to celebrate? I'll give two examples of what has changed. Climate change and biodiversity have changed. There's some other changes that have happened that is mostly changes to us as Christians or as people. I'm going to deal with something, a little warning that Pope Francis has given us. We must avoid declarationist nominalism. That's a technical term, and we'll unpack that in a minute. what must still be done. So the agenda is still open for Laudato Si, and ultimately we must not lose hope. So this is what I'm hoping to cover in the next 38 minutes. Firstly, an encyclical is a letter. So a pope writes a letter. That's why at the top of, if you go to the website of the Vatican and you look at the encyclical Laudato Si, right at the very top it says Laudato Si, written by the Holy Father Francis about the topic, care for our common home. So it's a letter of Pope Francis about care for our common home. It was given on the 24th of May, so we're actually a few days early ahead of the 10th anniversary of the publishing of the encyclical. Today is the 20th of May, so in 4 days' time, on Saturday, it will actually be the 10th anniversary of the publishing. But there's also a liturgical anniversary because it was published on the solemnity of Pentecost. So this year, Pentecost will be on the 8th of June. And so if we're looking for an anniversary, it's either the calendar date or it's the liturgical date. So the solemnity of Pentecost this year will be on Sunday in 2 weeks' time. So that could be our liturgical celebration, our liturgical anniversary. It was published in the year 2015. Pope Francis tells us it was in the 3rd year of his pontificate. You remember he was elected in 2013, so it's 13, 14, 15, the 3rd year of his pontificate. And then right at the end, it's signed by himself, Franciscus. Generally, popes sign in Latin for some reason, because we belong to the Latin Rite. So this is the header. These lines here are the header of the encyclical. You'll find it always at the top. And then right at the bottom, I've gone to the bottom of the encyclical. This is after all the text. Before the footnotes, here's the footer of the encyclical. So we've got the start and the end of the encyclical. So what is an encyclical? An encyclical is a letter which a pope writes on a particular topic, generally to a particular group of bishops. Generally, encyclicals are written to bishops, not to the general public. Normally, the bishops or the patriarchs or the primates are specified. The Pope says, and I'll give us an example in a minute, the Pope says, I'm writing to the bishops of Germany or the bishops of Italy or something. Some encyclicals are addressed to a wider audience. For example, Pacem in Terris, Pope John the 23rd, writing about peace in the year 1963, during the time of the Second Vatican Council. Pope John the 23rd wrote about peace, and he says these are the people to whom he's writing: to our venerable brothers, the patriarchs, the primates of the Eastern Catholic churches, to archbishops and bishops, to all other local ordinaries who are at peace and in communion with the Apostolic See. So that's local ordinaries, not even of Catholic churches, but of churches, kind of Christian churches around the world. To all the clergy, to all the faithful people of the Catholic world, and to all men and women of goodwill. So Pacem in Terris breaks the mold a little bit. The Pope is not just writing to bishops, the Pope is writing also to clergy and faithful, that's you and me, and he's writing to men and women of goodwill. So people who are well-disposed, people who are trying to work for peace. In Laudato Si, it's different as well. Rather than just addressing bishops, Pope Francis wishes to address every person living on the planet. Because his topic is so universal, he's writing about care for our common home, care for the planet, care for the earth, our mother. And so he wants to speak to everybody living on this planet, not just Catholics, not just clergy, not just bishops, not just individuals. He wants to address everyone, speak to everyone. Normally, the name of the encyclical comes from the first few words of the Latin text, what they call in Latin the incipit, the first couple of words of the Latin text. So, for example, we've got Mater et Magistra, mother and teacher, and so it's about the church. Those are the first few words of that encyclical, the church, our mother and teacher. Pope Pius broke the tradition, not by using Latin, but by using Italian. when he was writing specifically to the Italian bishops, and he's talking about the fascism that was taking place in Italy at the time. He was talking about fascism in Italy, so he's addressing specifically Italy. And he wrote, non abbiamo bisogno, we don't need, and in Italian, we don't need. And then he carries on saying what it is that we don't need. And then Pope Pius XI again wrote in German about kind of Nazism in Germany. And he wrote Mit brennender Sorge in the year 1937. So you remember Nazism was on the ascendancy, and it's before the Second World War. And he's writing about the burning concern, with burning concern. Francis used Italian. His encyclicals, two of them were given their names in Italian, Laudato Si, which means praised be. They're the first two words of the hymn, Praise Be to You, My Lord, by Saint Francis of Assisi. And those are the opening two words of the encyclical Laudato Si. And then there's Fratelli Tutti. You remember Pope Francis wrote that during the pandemic, saying that we're all brothers. All of us are brothers. Fratelli tutti, all of us are brothers. And so he's used Italian for the names of two of his encyclicals. The tradition of writing encyclical letters began in 1740. There were some early encyclicals which have been lost. Maybe the first encyclical we get is from Peter, the letters of St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome, or the overseer of the church in Rome. And if we think that the papacy goes back to St. Peter, and some of us believe that it goes back to Peter, so then the letters of Peter might be the first encyclical letters of the Christian tradition. But then there was a big gap. Many of the encyclicals were lost in the meantime. And then Benedict XIV began the tradition again of writing encyclical letters in the year 1740. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII started the tradition of social encyclicals. So encyclicals addressing specific social topics. And the famous one that he wrote starting this social tradition was Rerum Novarum, talking about the new things, specifically new relationships of trade, of workers' rights and things like that. And so 1891 marked the beginning of the Catholic social teaching through the vehicle of encyclicals. And there have been 19 social encyclicals since 1891. So in 130-something years, there have been 19 social encyclicals. Here's an encyclical. I mentioned it earlier. Here's an encyclical by Pope Pius XI, and he's writing to his brothers, greetings and apostolic blessings, mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern. And he's saying, with burning concern, we're seeing what's happening in Germany. And he's writing to the venerable brother archbishops and bishops of Germany, and to the other shepherds or over-shepherds who are living in peace and community with the Apostolic See, about the situation of the Catholic Church in the German Empire. So we have to get out of our minds that encyclicals are always written in Latin. Pope Francis composed Laudato Si. Apparently, he composed it in Spanish. So Spanish was the original language. Normally, Latin is the original language. But here, this one, Mit brennender Sorge, was composed in German and was published in German. What is special about Laudato Si? Why do we sort of want to come back to it again and again over 10 years? Firstly, it's the first encyclical dedicated specifically to the environment. Okay, we've got social teaching about the place of workers, about what social teachings do we have? The place of workers, the industry, about communism, about the fall of communism, about people's rights, about medicine and things like that. But this one is dedicated specifically to the environment. And so that's what identifies Laudato Si. Popes John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul II, Pope Benedict the 16th, and Patriarch Bartholomew had previously taught about the environment, and Pope Francis quotes all of them. But here Pope Francis dedicates Laudato Si entirely to the environment, to ecology, and to the human condition in the environment. I think Laudato Si is important because it captures an era in history, our era, the era of the planetary crisis, the era where things, at least we understand, we know that things are going wrong inside of our common home. This encyclical, in a way that no other encyclical has done, to my knowledge, has released commitment and enthusiasm and joy among Christians of all denominations, of many denominations, in a way that no earlier papal document had done. This encyclical really speaks to people's concerns. It captures people and it moves them in a way that no earlier papal document had done. The encyclical incorporates a lot of cutting-edge science, and science is religion neutral. Science doesn't know religion. Science doesn't bow to the Christian God or the Jewish God or the Muslim God. Science is science, and it claims to be objective. But Pope Francis is quoting a lot of contemporary cutting-edge science as it was in 2015. And he mixes that with social science, and he mixes that with faith. The primary concern is social. I heard Pope Francis speaking in 2016 about Laudato Si, and he was asked, is this an environmental encyclical or is it a social encyclical? And Francis says, no, it's definitely a social encyclical. But he also says in the encyclical, there isn't a social crisis and an environmental crisis. They're both dimensions of the same crisis. We don't have two separate crises. The social crisis is an environmental crisis, and the environmental crisis is a social crisis. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. Laudato Si systematically quotes experiences from around the world. Pope Francis takes the experience of bishops' conferences, particularly from around the world. And I'm proud to say that the first bishops' conference that's quoted is the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, where the bishops in South Africa and Botswana wrote about, and Eswatini wrote about the environment, wrote about the problems that our environment is facing. And that was in the year 1999, 16 years before the publication of Laudato Si. And Pope Francis quotes bishops from every continent from all around the world. And then Laudato Si is memorable because it talks about integral ecology. Pope Francis says that everything is interrelated. We can't deal with things in isolation. We can't say the rosary and that's my prayer devotion without somehow bringing in our concern for our family and our concern for society and our care for the environment. Everything is integrated. It's all part of a whole seamless cloth of human and Christian concern. This is the content of Laudato Si. Those of you who've done a webinar with me before have probably seen this. The point I want to make really is that it follows the traditional pastoral circle where you have see, the movement of see, you see what's going on, you judge and you act. And it's like a cycle which goes round and round and round and round. See, judge, act, see and pray, of course. See, judge, act, pray, see, judge, act, pray. And whenever we see something new, we have to kind of use our informed reasoning. We see what's going on in our common home, chapter 1. We use our reasoning, we use our faith, chapter 2. What does our faith tell us about what's going on here? We judge from a social analysis. We look at kind of the social dynamics that are going on, why there's so much poverty, why, and Francis makes it very clear that why humans are at the root of the ecological crisis. He doesn't have any time for climate change denialists or for any skeptics. In his social analysis, he makes it very clear, he goes along with the majority of scientific opinion, that humans are at the root of the ecological crisis. And he continues judging, looking at principles from Catholic social teaching. Chapter 4 looks at Catholic social teaching, that tradition since 1891. What does the church say about the environment? And Pope Francis proposes an integral ecology where we see everything as related and belonging together. And once we understand, once we've judged what's going on, we go on to action. Pope Francis says we need dialogue. We talk with everybody. We talk with scientists. We talk with people of other religions. We talk to those even who are in denial, those who are not specifically of goodwill or who particularly like the Christian church. Pope Francis says, what do we have to do? We have to engage with other people. We have to dialogue. Remember, he's the Pope who speaks about the apostolate of encounter. We go out and encounter people. We don't encounter people just on our television screens or our cell phones. We dialogue with people. And then the final chapter, chapter 6, is about education and spirituality. We have to educate ourselves, we have to educate our children, and that education must do something to us. It must change our feelings. It must change our relationship to the world. It must help us to really desire to be better citizens in the world. It must help us to kind of look towards and pray for things that are going to change. It makes practical demands on our lives and our lifestyles. And so that's these two steps here, chapter 5 and chapter 6, are about action. And then Pope Francis ends the encyclical with two prayers. One is a prayer which Christians can pray. It refers to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It refers to our Christian Trinity. It speaks to Mary right at the end, the mother of all Christians. And then the other prayer is a prayer which can be said by people of no faith or people who don't believe in the Trinity, a prayer for our earth. So right at the end, there are two prayers, and then we can start reading the encyclical again. We can start saying what's going on in our common home. Has anything changed or something like that? So the point I want to make it, see, judge, act, see, judge, act, see, judge, act. That's the way kind of the pastoral cycle works. Some brief quotes from the encyclical, what I call takeaways. The one that I've seen quoted most frequently is the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. And so that's in chapter 1, where he's saying what's happening to our common home. He's observing what's going on here. And then he goes on in 21 to lament that elderly people like myself have happy memories of when things were more beautiful. And now we're lamenting that the earth is not as beautiful as it was. In number 45, where he talks about the disposable society, where he talks about the throwaway culture, he says that some people are also victims of the throwaway culture. People themselves, for example, people in prisons, or people who living in remote areas, or people who living in South Africa's history in the townships. These are the throwaway, the disposable people of society, the people who don't add value to the normal kind of dominant capitalist society. And Pope Francis says that this is a sin. This is not good for us. We can't simply dispose of people because they're not interesting to us. Some of us may remember Father Cosmas Desmond, who was a priest working in Johannesburg, who wrote about the discarded people, the people taken up from their homes and dumped in the so-called homelands when South Africa was going through its homelands policy. Disposable people, the discarded people. And Pope Francis says this is unacceptable. Number 48 of the encyclical, a quotation from the Bolivian bishops. The gravest effects of all the attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest people. So whatever's happening, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution or the spoiling of water, it's always the poorest people who suffer most. And that's the Bolivian bishops, but that comes up again and again and again in Laudato Si. And then Pope Francis talks about why is this happening. He says that ethical degradation and environmental degradation are linked. We don't care for the environment to the extent that we don't care for other people. or humans are just kind of not living up to our vocation. And in that way, we're making it happen that other people are not cared for, their environment is not cared for. In number 68, when he's doing his theological analysis, what does the church tradition teach us? He says that the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism, that is just concern about human beings, which is unconcerned for other creatures. The Bible has no place for this. And he continues in number 68, nor does the Catechism. The Catechism condemns this tyrannical anthropocentrism, thinking that human beings are the measure of absolutely everything. If it's valuable for me, that's when it's valuable. Pope Francis continues, we continue to tolerate, if we continue to tolerate that some people are more important than others, some people consider themselves more human than others, some people think that they're born with more rights than others, then that's a problem. We seem to do it. That seems to be going on here. This is kind of the social analysis that he's giving in the chapter on social analysis. In number 143, ecology also involves preserving the cultural treasures of humanity in the broadest sense. Music, landscapes, artworks. You may remember when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, they destroyed ancient monuments that were thousands of years old because they didn't conform with their idea of Islam. When another Islamic group took over in Timbuktu, they destroyed an ancient library, and these are cultural treasures which belong to the whole of humanity. Pope Francis says that we have to preserve our cultural identity as well and cultural ecology. A question he asks continuously under the topic of intergenerational solidarity: what kind of world do we want to leave to those who are coming after us? Do we want to leave them a world filled with junk, or do we want to leave them a world that's still beautiful and green and able to support life? And then in a chapter on civic and political love, Pope Francis echoes Pope Benedict, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict's encyclical 2009, that love expresses itself in truth, and love is political, and love actually is a social love. It's not just something which you have between a husband and wife or a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Love is political, and love has social implications. And then this chapter on civic and political love prepares us for his encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, saying that we're all brothers and sisters, which came subsequently 5 years after Laudato Si. Every year, the church celebrates Laudato Si week. Okay, every year, the church celebrates Laudato Si week. There's even a website called laudatosiweek.org. And on that website, you can find resources for your own parish or for your own small Christian community or for your own personal prayer. There's some resources that you can just click on the website. The theme for this year, 2025, is about raising hope. Okay. I'm going to give you, in the next few minutes, some reasons why we may possibly lose hope when we see how things are progressing. But the theme for this year is to raise hope. Don't lose hope. Remember, we're in a Jubilee year of hope. We're pilgrims of hope. And so the theme for this year ties in with the Jubilee year theme. I ask, if we celebrate every year, what is there to celebrate? Has the encyclical achieved anything? How has the church's attitude changed over these years? And these questions you can just answer for yourself very quickly in your own minds. What have Catholics done which we might not otherwise have done? Since I read Laudato Si, has it made me different? Has it changed me in any way? What is the state of the earth 10 years after the encyclical was published in 2015? Have major advances been made to protect the earth? And have small steps been made as well? What small steps am I taking? I'm not a big politician. I don't go to these big international United Nations meetings. I'm not involved with legislators, but each of us can make small steps, take small steps. Do we notice these small steps forward? Now I come to what might have changed or what has changed since 2015. Remember, in 2015, Pope Francis addressed the United Nations in New York very shortly before the Paris climate meeting was held in 2015. And everyone was enthused by Pope Francis' enthusiasm. They caught his sense of urgency, and most countries that were at Paris, they signed the Paris Climate Accord, and they committed themselves to continuing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that was the commitment in Paris. They all said we will have nationally determined contributions to reducing our greenhouse gas outputs. But since 2015, in some places, the world has actually passed the 1.5 degree warming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, in the last several years, we've had the hottest years on record, year after year after year. So the world is still getting warmer and warmer and warmer. In 2019, 2020, and 21, we had the coronavirus pandemic that caused a brief slowdown in carbon emissions, but in fact, we haven't built back better. Remember, that was the slogan we used a lot, build back better. When we return to our activities, it should be more sympathetic, more compassionate. It should be better for the environment. It should be better for our brothers and sisters, as Pope Francis tells us in Fratelli Tutti. We had this pandemic. Has the pandemic really changed anything? Or have people just business people tried to make a bigger profit quicker and faster? Biodiversity loss since 2015 continues apace. We observe daily, if we watch television, the news, wars in the DRC, in Mozambique, in Sudan, in Palestine, in Yemen, in Syria, in Ukraine. These wars have displaced millions of people. And we expect climate change is going to displace more millions of people. And that has a very, very disruptive effect, obviously, on the lives of the people who are immediately affected, but it has effects on the lives of people in the receiving countries as well. Extraction of fossil fuels has continued. We've seen attempts to do fracking in the Karoo. We've seen attempts to do offshore exploitation of gas and oil off our coastline in South Africa. It's happening in the deep ocean. They're trying to start conventions. The United Nations is trying to start conventions about exploitation of the deep ocean. And just the extraction of fossil fuels has not slowed down. We talk about peak coal or we talk about peak oil, but in fact, the earth is still, or the economies are still consuming more oil and coal and gas than they ever did before. So Pope Francis, 2 years ago, 8 years after Laudato Si, he wrote Laudate Deum. And he said, I said something 8 years ago, things are getting worse, not better. So that's in terms of kind of theological urgency. This is an exhortation. He's really, really saying, guys, I'm asking you to change. Politicians, but also young lay people, individuals like ourselves. And then since 2015, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been transgressed or crossed. Now, planetary boundary theory is the basic scientific theory that Pope Francis used when he was writing Laudato Si. The theory was put forward by the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009. They identify 9 conditions which make the world livable for the human beings. You know, we can live within certain temperature range. We need fresh water. We need land to be able to produce food. We don't want ozone kind of because we'll get skin cancer and things like that. We have to live with clean air, atmospheric aerosol loading. So Pope Francis takes 7 of these planetary boundaries, and he looks at them and saying, says, human beings need to be able to survive. So the Stockholm Resilience Center updated in 2015 and then in 2023 their planetary boundary theory. And you can see there's more and more red as we go from left to right. There are more and more of these boundaries which have been transgressed. We're getting more and more into danger zones and unpredictable zones with pollution, for example, novel entities, with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with the way lands are changed, desertification, destruction of wetlands, the way water is being wasted, the way chemicals are being put onto the earth and things like that. So in 2023, 2 years ago, the Stockholm Resilience Center said we're really getting into danger zones with 6 out of these 9 planetary boundaries. We can have an entire lecture on that, so we're not going to. I'll just have a look at 2. One regards climate change. We're in a danger zone as far as climate change is concerned. I'm not going to read out this entire thing. You can see it for yourself, or you can just take a screenshot. But when the 2024 press release was made of the emissions gap, so this is from United Nations Convention on Climate Change, they're saying we're trying to reduce our emissions, but there's a gap between the amount of emissions we reduce and the actual planned required emissions of reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. So when this report is about the gap, we have to reduce, but we're not reducing sufficiently. And so when Inga Anderson published it in October, she said, we're on track for a 2.6 to a 2.8 degree rise in temperature since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So by the end of the century, if we continue the way we are, as things stand, we're in for a 2.8 degree rise. If nothing changes, if we carry on business as usual, the temperature is going to rise by 3.1 degrees, and that'll be catastrophic, even for those of us living in nice climate-friendly places, away from the sea, away from rising sea levels and things like that. It'll be catastrophic if we just carry on with business as usual. She says some parts of the world are drowning. People are struggling to cope. And struggling to survive. She says in the publication of this GAP report that the protocol on biodiversity is going to be defeated because climate change is causing raging wildfires, storms that are ruinous, desertification, land degradation. These things are devastating species because they're devastating the ecosystems and the habitats that many of these species live in. And so she concludes her introduction. The new nationally determined commitments must cut greenhouse gases by 42% by 2030. And if we don't do that, then we have to cut them by 57% by 2035. And kind of the longer we wait, the longer we sort of carry on with business as usual, the more we have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions, the more we have to buy smaller cars or not travel by car at all because motor cars pump out greenhouse gases. So she's making the connection here between climate change and biodiversity. The most recent kind of major publication from the United Nations Environmental Programme on biodiversity came out in 2020, so 5 years ago, the Global Biodiversity Outlook. And it tells us that there are these 2, 4, 6, 8 aspects of human life and human society and economics. There are these 8 dimensions here that we really have to ensure that we look after them properly. The lands and the forests, fresh water, our fisheries and oceans. Now there are conventions being put in place to protect open seas, to try to make the seas at least 1/3 of the oceans, no fishing zones and things like that. We need sustainable agriculture. Our food systems have to be sustainable as well.
Excuse me,
Climate
Peter.
change infrastructure has to be in place.
Excuse me.
Hello?
May I kindly ask you to conclude in the next minute or so that
Okay,
we
I'll
can
do my best,
stay on our
Clemens.
schedule? Okay,
Okay,
welcome.
thanks. 1945, I'll stop. Okay, thanks very much. So all of these things have to be changed. We need significant shifts in the way we look after our Earth so that other species can continue to survive. My sister took this photograph recently of a broken web. Normally, the web of life is very, very integrated. Every species depends on every other species, but here the web of life seems to be collapsing. Every species, if you mess around in one part of a web, it has consequences in another part of a web. And so biodiversity is very, very interdependent. What other changes have we had? Young people have taken up leadership, as they did in South Africa in 1976. And there are all of these young people's movements, which I think are very good cause for hope. Change leaders are receiving training. For example, the Laudato Si movement trains environmental leaders and people to do leadership there. Our economies are moving more and more towards alternative energy, or what we call renewable energy, which puts out less. I won't say it's carbon neutral, but they put out less carbon dioxide and methane and global greenhouse gases. People are becoming more aware of persistent organic pollutants, such as pharmaceuticals and plastics, and work is beginning on an international convention on plastic pollution and the production of plastics. So those are changes that are taking place. The language of polycrisis is being used. So there are more and more crises which are interconnected. And if you adjust one part of the economy, it has effects elsewhere. So polycrisis, people are beginning to see we've got multiple crises which are all interrelated. I think importantly, Pope Francis has given people a spiritual language, a language where we can have an ecological spirituality, where Christians can say, it's okay for me to pray about the earth. It's okay for me to pray about the birds and the bees and the snakes and the dolphins and things like that. We see that we belong to nature, we're part of nature, and it's really given license to those of us whose prayer isn't related to other things or politics, but Francis has given us a language in the final chapter of Laudato Si, the spirituality chapter, where we see ourselves and we see it part of our mission as Christians to take care for our common home. And with our spirituality, there should be a coherence with our actions. Spirituality and action should go hand in hand. And then just something that I think we shouldn't dismiss is clicktivism. How many of us get, Clemens, 1 minute, okay? How many of us get daily emails saying, please protect the forests of Borneo or protect the forests of the DRC or something like that? Don't dismiss clicktivism. Your voice counts. And for some of us, that's the only place where we can make our voice count. So avoid nominalism. We have to just make sure that we don't think that because the encyclical has been written and published, that's going to solve everything. We actually have to do something. And then my final slide is what must still be done. So the Jesuits published this yesterday, Jesuits for Climate Justice. So for COP30, which is going to take place later this year, we need to strengthen the loss and damage fund. We need a just transition from polluting energy sources to more renewable energy sources. We need people's food systems to be safer. And then finally, these are things that you can do. Okay, Clemens, I finished now. Thanks. So I'll just leave the screen up for a minute for people to take on.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your wonderful presentation. And your insights are both inspiring, very provoking, and they helped us to reflect more deeply on our common core to take care of our common home. So at this particular time, we do not have any questions on the chat box. So I'd like to invite you, if you go beneath your screen, there is a React section. So you may raise your hand for the sake of order. You are 60 of you. on this platform. So if you've got any question, any clarification that you'd want Peter to explain, feel free. This is your opportunity now. We have 12 minutes left before we conclude our session. So you're most welcome.
Good.
Okay, I see John Clark has raised his hand. Maybe John would
Yes.
like to raise a question.
Yes, I just want to quickly share with you. I've been a social worker working with the Amadiba community in the Wild Coast, the Kolobeni Mineral Sands Project. And when the Laudato Si came out in 2015, it was a huge shot in the arm for us, because in 2011, Father Sean McDonough was here for COP17, and I had a long chat with him about it. And I was so astonished and delighted that when Laudato Si came out, Section 146 talked about the need to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions, and how they are being threatened by large mining and agricultural projects without regard for the degradation of nature and culture. It expressed exactly what we were going through in our whole struggle to stop this Australian mining company from actually destroying the land. So I just want to share that as a kind of a celebration of how important it was, and particularly the fact that, in a sense, I found that our voice on the Wild Coast had found its way into that document. And that's really kind of made me a bit more of a sort of less of a practicing Catholic and more of a convinced one. So I just wanted to share that, and maybe just ask the question about how we can take further the whole idea of local destinies being decided locally, and how Laudato Si is a very good, as it were, encyclical to help guide us on principles of subsidiarity, on principles of ensuring that the local people are the ones that actually are most attuned to what needs to happen, rather than waiting for things to come from the top down. So any comment on that, Peter? Thank you.
John, thank you very much. And thank you very much for that good news. It's so important for us to hear good news, and that Laudato Si has actually encouraged people in kind of, I won't say Kolobeni is that small, but I mean, with local issues, local fights and local concerns, Pope Francis makes it very clear that we all have to be involved. He encourages us all to be involved in political, even if it's kind of at grassroots level, local political campaigns and activities. It's not just left to the politicians and the people sitting in Parliament or the people sitting in the union buildings, but he's encouraging all of us to take a responsibility for what's going on in our local areas, and also obviously on the greater national scene. And so I think if we experience success in some local campaigns, that makes a big difference to our outlook and our courage and our hope for other campaigns. Thank you for that, John. Okay, there's a question here from Mary.
Yeah.
Would I consider doing a similar talk at Catholic schools in Johannesburg, northern suburbs? I'm available. I think it's best that Marianne contacts the Jesuit Institute, and we can arrange a date or some issue for that. I see another hand has been raised. Mary Lynn Aitken has raised her hand. Would you like to go ahead, Mary Lynn?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Peter. I'd just like to share a story of what parishes in Ireland are doing to bring back biodiversity. The Kunming Montreal targets, excuse me, call for 30% of all land to be restored to biodiversity. And from what I hear, many parishes in Ireland have taken this challenge on, and are trying to bring back natural grasses, flowers, etc., to trees, to their parishes. I'd like to challenge South African parishes to do the same. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks
Thank
so
you
much
very
for
much,
that.
Marilyn.
Okay. So let me just respond to that. In number 12 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes that Saint Francis asked that part of the friary garden always be left untouched so that wildflowers and herbs could grow there, and so that people who see them can raise their minds to God, the creator of such beauty. And so Pope Francis is encouraging us also to leave parts of our garden a little bit wild. I see a hand is raised all the way from Nigeria.
Yes, Dominic.
Dominic Mbaeze.
Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
All right. I was saying thank you. And I could remember how you fought for this when we were there at Tekima. Please, I have a very quick question. Right now, we're talking about 10 years. What do you have to say about those who do not accept Laudato Si? I mean, it was not globally accepted, I think so. So what do you have to say about those people at this time that are now having 10 years of experience of Laudato Si? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a very important question because Pope Francis has received a lot of pushback, a certain amount of pushback because of Laudato Si. Remember, he comes from Latin America, and so the great sin of Latin America was, as far as some people in the Catholic Church was concerned, was liberation theology. It was accused of being communist or Marxist inspired. So many people, when they read Pope Francis's economy, as it's laid out in Laudato Si, an integral economy, they said, here, this is Marxism being pushed in the name of religion. And so people were not happy. Some people were not happy. Pope Francis talks about an economy which is much, much more people-centered and environment-centered. And it's not about production and production and production and buy. And he really tries to warn us against consumerism. You get something simply because it's there to be bought. And so there was pushback against Pope Francis's kind of more vision of a more humane economy. And there's still some people who don't accept global warming. You may remember that George Bush II, or the junior, was president of the United States at the time, and he didn't accept the theory of global climate change. You may remember that he was heavily invested in the petrochemical industry, as Donald Trump is fairly heavily invested, or many of his supporters are invested in the coal mining industry. And so people always have reasons why they don't want to accept what the majority of scientists just take for granted these days. So people were accusing Pope Francis of introducing Marxism and communism into the church. I think time has proven Pope Francis to be correct, that global climate change is undeniable and biodiversity loss is undeniable. You just look at the facts and you have to have your head in the sand, or you have to have your head buried somewhere if you're trying to say that the world is not experiencing great disturbance in weather patterns, and the weather patterns are no longer constant as they have been in the past.
We are left with a minute or so. There was a hand raised by Susan. Susan, you can proceed.
Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Susan. My name is Susan from Kenya, and I've been working with children on a project on children environmental rights, whereby we empower children to become advocates of their environment, like amplifying their voices to platforms where they have, for a very long time, they have not been heard. And our philosophy has been on the document Synodality, Laudato Si, the United Nations General Comment 26. And my question is, we are trying to go the policy way, whereby we want our children to be heard and we are no longer speaking on their behalf. How can we use Laudato Si as a document to involve both the policymakers in terms of the government, the church? Because in Kenya, the church, it's not all, like Laudato Si has not been embraced that much, and we don't feel the church there. How can we use that document to ensure that children have a voice to platforms where they have not been heard before?
Thank you very much. I think the Laudato Si movement, if you go to the platform of the Laudato Si movement, you'll see there's a whole section there for universities, for parishes, for schools, for youth groups. And so you just need to find your level on the Laudato Si movement. I think it's important that teachers be informed or educated before they in turn become educators. I was talking to a very good friend of mine, a colleague of many years who works now no longer in the university world, but she's moved into agriculture, and she's helping religious communities all around Kenya to set up organic farming. And this is both profitable and very good for the environment. And I think in Kenya, it is happening. I was in Kenya from 2013 to 2023, and I've seen in parishes, they're kind of the little children who dance at Mass, and they can also go to catechism and learn about God loves us and God loves the creation, and God has made creation for our own good. But the important thing is that those who are accompanying the children have a concern themselves for the children and for the children's future. You're right that we shouldn't be speaking on their behalf, but in fact, there are very few platforms on which children can make their voices heard at an international level or at a national policy-making level. Children lack the patience and the maturity. Obviously, we've got younger adults, and I'm a great supporter of Fridays for the Future movement, where this young, somewhat autistic girl, as she was at the time, Greta Thunberg in Sweden, started protesting about the future which is being left for young people. And she had more and more and more support. And I believe that Fridays for the Future protests are also held in some schools in Nairobi, where people are saying this is our future and it's being messed up, and we shouldn't be inheriting a world where we're going to suffer so much from global climate change. So I think we have to empower children, we have to educate them, but we also have to listen to their voice, as you said. Francis's idea of synodality means that we listen to those who are voiceless, and we have to admit that children don't have a very strong voice in many countries in Africa.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. And thanks, everyone. The attendance is very overwhelming. Around 60 people attended this meeting. Very impressive. Your presence and contributions are greatly appreciated. And I wish you all the best. We have got about 5 questions on the chat box. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and maybe we can use these questions to reflect on our next session. So thank you very much, and I wish you a restful, peaceful night. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clemens.
Thank you.
May I have a last word there? If you just see in the chat box, Bernadette Crew Brown's response that the Green Anglicans have many resources for children. So you can go to the website of the Green Anglicans and you can get a lot of material there for children's groups. Thank you.